Welcome. This is the first in a series of videos concerning the prophecy of Daniel concerning the future of God's people, specifically understanding the history of Daniel and the meaning of the apocalyptic prophecies of Daniel 7 through 12. We are trying to understand how that Daniel's prophecies, apocalyptic prophecies, provided comfort for God's people with assurances of God's supremacy. This first video will be helpful in setting up historical backgrounds and timelines. A first step in analyzing and understanding the prophetic apocalyptic sections of Daniel is to note the timeline of the book with several important dates. Without taking time to address some of the difficulties that are encountered in understanding the divisions of the book of Daniel, especially the Aramaic section from chapters 2 through 7, some structural factors, we can summarize to say that the first 6 chapters are generally historical, and the last 6 chapters, the chapters that we will be studying in this series, are generally prophetic and apocalyptic. So the last 6 chapters, beginning with Daniel's vision in chapter 7, continuing with the interpretation of that vision, the expansion of that vision in subsequent chapters, that's the section of Daniel that we're going to be talking about. Several years before the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC, Daniel was carried into Babylonian captivity. The early stages of the exile begin in the year 609 BC with the death of King Josiah. Judah began to be carried into exile after the death of Josiah, and Daniel wrote the book that bears his name from Babylon. He was in Babylon, chapter 1 of Daniel, in the year 605. Daniel 2 can be dated specifically in the year 604 BC, and chapters 3 to 4 seem to follow sequentially soon after. In Daniel 5, we have a story of the fall of Babylon, which occurred in 539 BC. So we should note that between Daniel chapter 4 and Daniel chapter 5, we have the passage of over 60 years of time. That's not easy to see as you begin to read the text. I believe Daniel 6 can be dated shortly thereafter. It's interesting to note that the story of Daniel in the lion's den, which is so popular and so well known, actually occurs when Daniel is an old man. So the first 6 chapters of Daniel we can date like this: 605, shortly thereafter, chapters 1 through 4. And the events of these chapters occurred in the last years of the 7th century BC. Then, about 65 years later, chapters 5 and 6, immediately before and after the fall of Babylon. Now, as we come to the section of Daniel that we're most interested in, we note that we no longer have a chronological order. Daniel chapter 7 is clearly dated in the text of the book 553 BC. That's 14 years before the fall of Babylon. Daniel has a vision of 4 beasts. We'll come in more detail to each of these chapters in future videos. Right now, our purpose is to simply establish a number of important dates in the historical context. 2 years later, in Daniel chapter 8, Daniel's vision of a ram and a goat, an interpretation is given only 2 years after the vision of chapter 7. Another 12 years pass before Daniel 9, and yet, considering Daniel's prayer in the early part of chapter 9, we read that chapter 9 is an explanation of the vision of the ram and the goat. And then finally, in Daniel chapters 10 through 12, Daniel's vision of a man and the story of the kings of the north, the king of the south, chapters 10 through 12, 537 BC, a couple of years after the fall of Babylon. So Daniel then, as a book, covers a span of about 70 years. And again, the section of Daniel that we are going to be studying, the apocalyptic visions, we're going to see 4 specific visions in Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Daniel 9, an explanation of the vision of Daniel 8, and then chapters 10 through 12. Those are not in chronological order with the rest of the book. Now, there are some other historical timelines that are related to the book of Daniel that are also important. The dates given in this outline, the dates given on this slide are the traditional dates. Sometimes there's a variation by a year or two due to some of the difficulties of dating. For example, with the fall of Jerusalem, some would date 587 BC, some would say 586 BC. So several timeline events are important. First of all, the reign of King Josiah, beginning in the year 640 and to the year 609 when he died in a battle in Megiddo. In 626, we have the beginning of Jeremiah's prophecy. In 612, and all of these dates are BC, in 612, Nineveh falls according to the prophecy of Nahum. We have the beginning of the exile, a date that we have previously noted, the beginning of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel chapter 1, 605, and in 604 BC, we have the word of Jeremiah. We can date Jeremiah 25, verses 11 through 12, very specifically in the year 604. When we consider the fall of Babylon in 539 and the 70 years prophecy, it seems most logical that the prediction of the 70 years and the fulfillment of the 70 years is best understood as beginning in 609 and concluding in 539 with the fall of Babylon and the opportunity for God's people to return to their land. Now, there are some related timelines that we can also think about as we continue the chronology. In 597, we are to date the overrunning of Jerusalem when Jehoiakim rebelled, and then his son Jehoiakim was installed as a vassal king. And at that time, about 10,000 Jews were exiled to Babylon, including Ezekiel. And those joined those who had previously been exiled, for example, Daniel and others in the year 605. In 586, we have the fall of Jerusalem. That may, in some literature, be identified as 587. 539, Babylon is captured. Cyrus reigns after the capture of Babylon. 539, 538 would be the first year of the reign of Cyrus as king of Persia. We might just note, we'll come to it again, that Darius is either the name of a governor that was put in charge by Cyrus or is possibly Cyrus's throne name. In 537, we have the return of the first exile, or the first return of exiles under the leadership of Sheshbazzar. 516, the temple rebuilding was completed. Here we would put the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. In 486 to 465, this would be the reign of Xerxes, the story of Esther. 458, Ezra departs for Jerusalem. Another very interesting gap in the story occurs between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7, when about 60 years pass with no notice in the text. 444, Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the walls. And in 432, Nehemiah is recalled to Babylon. So those are other important dates. I want to give some selected political events that were occurring. 555 is the year that Cyrus united the Persians and the Medes. And so in a sense, we could say that Cyrus began his reign his leadership over the United Kingdom of the Medo-Persians in the year 555. Not for our immediate reference, but in the future, we'll also want to see that 323, again, all of these are BC dates, the death of Alexander. 333, Alexander had pretty well consolidated under his control all of the then known world. 246, the beginning of the Seleucid Empire with the control given with the killing of Antiochus II, various kings until Antiochus IV usurped the throne in 175. In 175, then, Antiochus IV made himself king of the Seleucids and began a reign over the area of Palestine. In 171 or 170, we have the death of Onias, the high priest of the Jews. He is killed and replaced. We have the end of the traceable lineage of the priesthood among the Jews. 171 to 164, the reign of Antiochus, a 7-year reign of terror, including the desecration of the temple in 165, the reconstruction of the temple, 164, and his death in 164, the temple reconstructed in 165. And 63, the beginning of the Roman Empire, that also is worth noting for us at this time. So all of this brings us to some understanding of a rather lengthy period of time of almost 1,000 years. I am only trying to set for us the historical context in this video. In 930 BC, the kingdom divided. 722, the fall of Israel. 609, we've already noted the beginning of the exile after the death of Josiah. 604, Jeremiah's word, Jeremiah's service as a prophet would extend from 626 at least until the fall of Jerusalem in 586, a period of some 40 years or more. 586, the destruction of Jerusalem. 555, another time we note, Cyrus unites the Persians and the Medes. The kingdom divided, Alexander's kingdom. 323, skipping over numbers of things that we may have opportunity to mention later. So 330 to 166 is usually identified as a Hellenistic period of time when there was an effort made to turn the whole world into a Hellenistic empire, if you will, with Greek influences. We have the rise of the Koine Greek, which made possible eventually the spread of the gospel. With Alexander's death in 323, his kingdom was split into 4 smaller pieces. Various of the smaller parts at first vied for power, but after numerous shifts, about 303, the empire was divided among 5 of his generals. And then eventually, as those struggles continued, time does not permit us to mention all of those things. Perhaps in a future video I can do that. But we have eventually a number of wars that lasted until 281 and resulted in the establishment of 3 main kingdoms: Egypt, Asia Minor, and Macedonia. The unity of the empire was gone, but the Greek civilization continued to spread. This is again the Hellenistic period, and the influence of the Greek culture also prepared the way for the translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek, the Septuagint, about 250 BC. The Jewish period, the Hasmonean period, we date from 166 to 163. The Jews were being greatly oppressed, of course, under the kingship of Antiochus IV. The Ptolemies had been tolerant of the Jews, but the Seleucid rulers were determined to force Hellenism on the Jews. Under the leadership of Antiochus IV, as he opposed Judaism and all religions, scripture was destroyed Laws were enforced with extreme cruelty. The oppressed Jews eventually revolted under the leadership of Judas the Maccabee. And so we're coming to a Maccabean period of time. The ever-weakening Seleucids were technically in control, but the Hasmoneans, Simon, the younger brother of Judas, about 20 years later, the Jews became semi-autonomous. And that is the state of the political scene for about another 100 years until the Roman general Pompey conquered much of the Near East, captured Jerusalem, and Palestine was subjected to Rome. And that set the stage for what was to follow with the expansion of Rome. And of course, Rome ruled for more than 500 years. I want you to try to grasp, even if it requires another view of this video, or perhaps your own notes, and there will be written notes linked and made available as these are published. Hopefully you can begin to see the importance of these dates as we begin to identify the kingdoms that Daniel is talking about. And some of the theories that over the years have been advanced are impossible when we begin to understand the political order, the exact dates, and what was occurring. I hope this is helpful to you. Again, we're studying the prophecies of Daniel about the future of God's people, specifically the prophecies of Daniel 7 through 12. In our next video, we will begin in chapter 7 with an explanation of that text, which thankfully is also interpreted in Daniel 7. Thank you for your interest in this study of the book of Daniel. Until our next study, God bless.